as vital as the mineral system is, as reflected in HTMA data, it's a very delicate system. And some people that are much more reactive to any change in that system than many other people. And I remind people, the HTMA data were not handed down on Mount Sinai with the 10 Commandments.
Hello and welcome to the Mineral Minded Podcast. Are you interested in learning more about vitamins, minerals, heavy metal detoxification, and natural health? We explore a range of topics that are related to mineral balancing science and hair tissue mineral analysis, including in-depth interviews, news, and commentary about the wonderful world of natural medicine. I'm your host, John Bumpus. Today on the Mineral Minded Podcast, we have Dr. Rick Malter. He is a retired clinical psychologist from Chicago and is what I consider to be a pioneer in the field of HTMA and mineral balancing science. Dr. Rick Malter earned his PhD in clinical and educational psychology from the University of Illinois and is the founder of malterinstitute.com. Rick is the author of 2 books, Strands of Health, A Guide to Understanding Hair Mineral Analysis, and Shrinking the Judge, Freeing the Inner Child, which are both available on Amazon. Dr. Rick Malter has also specialized in nutrition consultation for learning disabilities, ADD, and stress management. He uses nutritional data from a hair tissue mineral analysis to assess the mind-body connection and develops nutritional programs to help reduce the intensity of the person's stress response and therefore the psychological dominance of the judge. Hello, Dr. Malter. It is a real pleasure to have you here at the Mineral Minded Podcast. How have you been today?
I'm very fine, thank you. Even though it's very hot here in Arizona, about 85 degrees of very dry heat. Yeah,
so you're in a dry sauna then right now. You're cooking.
It can feel like a sauna, which can have a profound impact on people's minerals, especially if they're depleted in essential minerals like magnesium, sodium, and potassium. And they're losing those in the dry heat of Arizona in the summer or spring.
You know, the one thing that I think most people overlook is that in an hour of sweating, which is very common in a place like Arizona or Australia where I am, that you can sweat out the RDA of iodine. And most people are not getting enough iodine to begin with.
Absolutely.
So just by being in a hot climate, you actually increase your iodine requirements as well as those electrolyte minerals like you touched on.
Absolutely. And that's one of the good things that hair mineral analysis, or HTMA, gives us a much deeper understanding and appreciation for the major role that the minerals play in supporting our health. That's why I always like to go back to quoting Dr. Henry Schroeder, who wrote his book, Minerals and Man, probably about 50 years ago or so. And he simply observed the minerals are the spark plugs of life. They're the foundation. And when Dr. Eck and Dr. Watts did their basic research on hair mineral analysis, beginning about 1975 through 1980, during those 5 years, they pulled together the research of Dr. Hans Selye on what he eventually called the stress response. He pulled together Dr. Carl Pfeiffer's work on copper toxicity in his book, Mental and Elemental Nutrients, that he published in 1975. And Dr. Pfeiffer was an MD and a PhD, a brilliant scientist and medical doctor. And he devoted the whole chapter to copper excess or copper toxicity. Because already in 1975, he was observing the damaging health effects of female contraceptives, especially the birth control pill. And then, of course, the copper IUD creates contraception by directly poisoning the woman's cells and tissues with excess copper.
Yeah, it's too much copper. And I think the idea is that estrogen itself can increase the uptake of copper and vice versa. Taking excessive amounts of copper can also increase your estrogen in your body as well. So there's huge hormonal implications, which then can affect things like thyroid status, right? Because, calcium gets raised by excess copper.
And over the years, as I've worked with so many women who have slow oxidizer or slow metabolic type mineral patterns, it turned out that a lot of them had all or most of these symptoms on this checklist that I put together simply by recording what kind of problems and symptoms they related to me that were obviously related to the buildup of copper toxicity that was reflected in their HTMAs. And as a matter of fact, when I would interview a woman and go over her copper toxic, slow oxidizer, slow metabolic type mineral pattern, she would look at this list of symptoms. And for her, it was like looking in a mirror. And she would wonder, how did you know that I had all these problems? Well, these common copper toxic problems. And even more importantly, that kind of symptom list helps to really validate hair tissue mineral analysis profiles.
So can I'm just going to say that I will share a link to Dr. Rick Malter's copper toxicity checklist link under this video so that people can see it, because they can't really see it on the camera too well, and they can sit down and have a look at that themselves.
I can send you a link to it.
Sure, yeah.
You can post it directly.
Cool, yeah, we'll do that. And, I use that checklist in my intake form. And I ask people I put that list in there, and then I just let them choose the things that they feel were relevant to them. I know you asked about in the past or what they're going through now. I'd personally just ask them if they're going through it now. But more often than not, it's like you see people with 8, 10, 12 of those things. And usually those people that have those checklists, like with that many, it's usually highly suspected of copper excess. Is that correct?
That's correct. It would be very unusual if they have as many as 8, 10, 12 or more of the 31 items that I put on the checklist for them not to have a copper toxic HTMA.
Right.
But we need to distinguish between what I call the manifest copper toxicity, which would show the slow oxidizer mineral pattern, but a high copper in the test. But we can have a latent copper toxic HTMA showing the high calcium, low potassium, usually a low sodium, but the copper is not showing yet. That's what I call a latent copper toxicity.
And that's the pattern that's one of the most common that we find, right?
Because they're usually so burned out, they don't have enough adrenal activity to stimulate the production of ceruloplasmin in the liver in order to bind enough copper to pull it into circulation for it to show in the HTMA.
Absolutely. And a lot of people think that, hey, we'll just raise ceruloplasmin, right? That's going to fix the whole problem of copper toxicity. But it's actually a fool's errand to do that, because if you artificially just raise one lab biomarker, it doesn't mean you correct a systemic issue. And it doesn't correct the adrenal insufficiency just by raising ceruloplasmin.
No. You have to put the copper toxic syndrome into the broader context of the broader mineral pattern that we see very easily and clearly in so many HTMAs.
Right. Yeah. And just before we keep moving forward, I'm just curious about your thoughts about, they say that like people with a very low thyroid function, someone with high calcium to potassium ratio, that at least Dr. X said if it's over 18, then it indicates a form of psychosis. Right. And I think in the psychological field, people usually think the worst of that psychosis and not like that high functional psychosis where you don't see reality for what it is. And you just kind of have like this, you live in a fairyland kind of thing with ideologies and romantic ideas about life. And I find that like when people have that elevated calcium to potassium, that very often they're not really aware of some of the symptoms that they're going through. So even when they go through that copper checklist, they might not choose everything that they're actually going through because they lack that awareness. You find that as well?
Yeah, I think that's related to the buildup of the calcium shell, which winds up being a wall or a block to their access to nervous system and psychological functions and health functions.
Yeah, I've always seen that they're very numb to a lot of emotions. They can be very cold people, and that they lack that awareness, like even emotional awareness of even their own actions or what people are doing to them. They've kind of dulled themselves to it, right? Desensitized.
And also, if they have a history of abuse, either in the past, in childhood, or in more recent or current relationships, that calcium shell is a psychological defense, creating that kind of block to feeling and a kind of emotional numbness. And interestingly, as they follow an HTMA supplement protocol that begins to detox some of that excess copper and to break up the calcium shell, all of a sudden, they're much more aware of what they're feeling and what's happening to them internally and coming at them externally.
I see that in my practice daily. And, you know, what I really also see is that even when that shell starts to come down and they start to become more of aware, sometimes they feel even more emotional, more anxious, more depressed, because now they are not numbed to the stuff that they've always been exposed to. And I think that's really fascinating aspect of, you know, mineral balancing and hair tissue mineral analysis.
Well, one of the reasons why they feel so emotional is that with the copper dumping, as Dr. Rick refers to it, or a detox process, that further lowers potassium in ratio to sodium. So their sodium-potassium stress ratio goes higher, and their fight or flight responses become more intense. And that's what drives all that emotionality as the copper is detoxed and the calcium shell breaks up. So it's important to look at the broader context and not be surprised that stress responses will intensify. Fight or flight. Fight is anger and rage. Flight is anxiety and panic attacks. And the high calcium potassium by itself, lowering the energy of the thyroid activity, may manifest in many people as depression with such low energy.
I think it's quite common that depressed energy, depressed body, depressed mind, isn't it? It's kind of...
When I was a graduate student at the University of Chicago in the program on human development psychology, it was a very Freudian psychological oriented program. Freud's id, ego, and superego. And so on the campus, no one was noticing that among all the people on campus at the University of Chicago, the head was usually attached to the body. But Freudian psychology focused primarily from the chin up.
So you're saying that there was the divide
The
between them.
University of Chicago and started studying hair analysis, that I realized, the head is attached to the body. We better pay attention. Interesting, when I first got introduced to hair analysis, since it was a, quote, medical, unquote, lab test, I thought I was moving from my profession of psychology into the medical realm, until I realized that the HTMAs reflected so much about the impact of stress on the vast majority of people doing HTMAs. And that's fight or flight, that's emotions and behavior, that's psychology. So that's the psychophysiology of stress. And when my wife was studying to get her biofeedback certification back in the mid-1980s, we flew down from Chicago to a biofeedback conference in Albuquerque, New Mexico.
You said biofeedback or biofield, or are you talking about both?
Biofeedback.
Okay.
And so as I was looking through the program, I noticed that there was a workshop on the physiology of stress with special references to the neuroendocrine system. And Dr. Watts refers to a hair analysis as reflecting neuroendocrine functions. And so I decided, hey, I'm going to take that workshop. It was an all-day workshop given by Mary Astorita, a PhD in chemistry and in physiology, who was teaching in the medical school of the Indiana University Medical School. So I was fascinated by this because it laid the scientific foundation for much of what Drs. Eck and Watts talked about in their hair analysis seminars, because it's all related to stress and neuroendocrine functions. And so I was very excited with all I learned that day from this brilliant physiologist. And most of the biofeedback people had very little interest in it. They were just taking it to get the continuing education credits for the biofeedback certification. And then I talked to her afterwards and explained to her about HTMA, and she was glad to hear there was a lab test that provided even more data about her specialty. And then when I mentioned the book to Dr. Watts, I think he still includes it as a reference from the TEI lab.
I'm glad you brought up biofeedback, because it was a big thing for me when I had a calcium shell to really spend time with myself and start to regulate my own nervous system. And I ended up, and I still have it to this day, right here, it's an M-Wave 2. And you basically plug it in and you can attach it to your ear and you can tell if you're in a sympathetic state or not. Mm-hmm. And I'll tell you, when I was in a calcium shell and when I was first getting in touch, when my mind was starting to realize that, my body wasn't coherent with it or on the same page, that I thought I wasn't stressed. Like I just thought, I'm relaxed. There's nothing going on. But I'll tell you, the M-Wave or even my biofeedback device was like, no, you're in a stress state right now. Mm-hmm. And that was normal for me. I did not know that I was just always in this chronic stress state. And playing with one of those devices, I found really helpful with hair testing, because you can use it to kind of tune in to where you're at and say, hey, I'm in that stress state. No wonder my potassium is always so low, or I have this really high calcium to phosphorus ratio because I'm in parasympathetic dominance because I'm always stressed. And you can kind of take control of it in that moment to moment. So I still refer to a hair test as a biofeedback test because it gives us a 3-month picture of our autonomic nervous system, whereas one of these devices will give us right now. It's a lot like the blood and the hair testing combined, right?
Right. And so you can validate the two testing approaches, comparing one with the other.
Absolutely, yeah. So maybe we can touch on just some of the history of HTMA. So I know that you've been doing HTMA for 42 years and you got into it for your own health reasons. Maybe you can touch on that and then we can go a little bit forward in that kind of area.
Yeah. Well, I had gotten my PhD in education and school psychology from the University of Illinois in Urbana-Champaign. And that was in 1971. And so we already had our 4 kids. Our youngest was born in 1970. And going to work as a psychologist in various schools and hospitals and clinics turned out to be highly stressful. And by 1980, I was in terrible shape. My mind was in a total fog. I was constantly exhausted. The only time I could boost energy was if I got out and exercised, playing tennis and doing some kind of very active
So stimulating yourself.
that would give me a temporary boost and then I'd crash again. Nothing was sustaining my energy. And I had a big red growth on my forehead here, about the size of a quarter.
Okay.
US dollars. And the dermatologist that I went to sent me to the University of Illinois Medical Center to consult with their chief of dermatology. And so he brought in his chief resident and had him take a chunk out of that, send it to pathology. They were expecting it would come back malignant. But they were disappointed. Didn't test malignant at the time. So they took another chunk. Same thing. Didn't come back. They did that 5 times. Finally, they gave up and said, well, I guess it's not malignant, except it looked very, very malignant. I was relieved that they didn't get a positive pathology response. But I was still exhausted. And about the same time, I had done a 6-hour glucose tolerance test with my chiropractor. And the first blood draw with the fasting blood sugar was 45, which is, is extremely low, just above being in a coma. So they gave me the glucose. My glucose levels over the next couple hours shot up to the 160s. And then over the remaining hours of the 6-hour test, the glucose level came crashing down. The last blood draw was 35 at the end of 6 hours. And of course, I had the headaches, the shakes, all of the awful symptoms of reactive hypoglycemia. So I knew I had a problem.
Yeah.
But nobody could figure out, well, what's behind it. Fortunately, I was working with a couple of gentlemen who opened a outpatient clinic in one of the Chicago suburbs near where I lived and practiced. And they asked me to be their psychologist to do psych testing for them. And they were doing hair analysis with kids who had a diagnosis of ADD or ADHD or learning disabilities. Okay. And the PhD educator and I became close friends. And he realized I was in terrible shape. So he said to me, Rick, you better get a hair analysis. He got the test. And as he's looking at it, he puts his thumb and forefingers close together like that and tells me, Rick, you're this close to a heart attack. How did he know that? Well, my magnesium was 0.9. And the ideal hair magnesium is around 6. So obviously it was very low. And my calcium was 17. So my Cal-Mag ratio is up close to 19 to 1, and the ideal ratio is close to 7 to 1. So it was a double indicator of a severe magnesium deficiency that had a devastating effect in regulating my blood sugar and put me at all the other health risks of a severe magnesium deficiency. But he got my attention. I started on magnesium and other supplements, and I've been obsessed with magnesium ever since.
It's interesting that elevated calcium to magnesium ratio, at least according to the research trends, is it's correlated with blood sugar issues, but we can't tell if it's what type of blood sugar issue, to be honest. We can't tell if it's reactive hypoglycemia or anything, but a really high ratio or a very low ratio, both correlated with at least research trends for diabetes.
Right. So diabetes runs in my family. Mm-hmm. Alcoholism runs in my family. So over the years, I found in working with many of my psychology clients who had high Cal-Mag ratios, not only did they have blood sugar issues, but they were alcoholics or adult children of alcoholics. So I saw the Cal-Mag ratio not only as the blood sugar ratio is described by Drs. Eck and Watts, but I dubbed it the addiction and alcoholism ratio.
Okay. That's interesting because I find that alcohol is a diuretic, so it causes you to eliminate electrolytes. And one of the ones that I see most commonly is really high sodium potassium ratio or really high sodium potassium levels, but it's usually an inversion or a low NAK ratio. So they're exhausted, but they're running on a stimulant and that simple sugar as like a means to get by.
They're just surviving, getting by like that. They can't sustain it, and they'll try running on adrenaline like that for a while, and elevated blood sugar, and then they reach a point where they totally crash, and they're unable to continue and function anymore.
Absolutely. And most people don't realize, I know we're talking about blood sugar, now we're talking alcohol, but alcohol depletes copper. And it's one of those unique situations where you can have someone that's very depleted in vitamin B1, and you can have someone that's also copper deficient because of just the alcohol utilizing that copper and causing an increased elimination of it. So it's just something I find interesting. I don't know if you agree, Rick, but that's something I find. And it's interesting because I was at the pub the other day, just because we were getting pizza. It was Erin's birthday, my wife's birthday. And, I was like, like where you get the pizza that we were going to get, they had like wine and they had, beer on tap, and they have copper pipes leading for the alcohol. And I was just like thinking, well, this is interesting because if alcohol lowers copper and now they have an acidic beverage that's coming up through a copper pipe, it just led me down this little, do you get lost in your thoughts sometimes? It was like, how would this relate to HTMA,
Once we have the foundational set of concepts and principles for understanding and appreciating HTMAs, then we're constantly able to think in terms of mineral patterns, fast or slow, copper toxicity, magnesium deficiency, and stress. It's just a natural way of thinking, but it's like having a unique language based on these essential concepts and principles. And because it's a unique language, people who are not versed in HTMA concepts and principles don't understand what we're talking about. It's like we are talking a foreign language to them. And this includes allopathic healthcare professionals, MDs, nurses, osteopathic physicians, chiropractors, naturopaths, dietitians.
It's very frustrating to me sometimes when because I have to work in an integrative practice a lot of the time with medical doctors or with another naturopath or whatever it is. It just seems to be that clientele I get that goes to multiple different practitioners. And the hardest thing for me is communicating the importance of the mineral patterns. So someone will say, you need to focus on the gut health, and they want to throw in all this gut stuff. And I'm always like, okay, we need to do that. But what happens if we don't have enough zinc, or if we don't have enough magnesium, or if the person's always in a chronic sympathetic state? Like, all that's going to affect the gut health. So people are often overlooking the influence of vitamins and minerals. And I always see that it's, they're quick to recommend herbs or something like that nature. And I've come to the conclusion, because when I was learning, I started my natural health journey in herbology, right? And then I did advanced herbology, which is the pharmacokinetics of plant molecules, which is cool. But I never found someone deficient in dandelion. I never found someone deficient in nettle. But with hair testing, I find people deficient in magnesium, deficient in selenium, deficient in zinc, all the time. So it's just this, as you're saying, their views kind of guide their practice. And if they don't have these important principles and philosophies that we cover in HTMA science, then it changes their whole outcome of what they recommend. And then it also, in the end, affects the clients, right?
Well, we've all been exposed to different approaches to healthcare. We're bombarded with advertising and media messages related to allopathic medicine, diagnoses of different diseases, and of course, prescription drugs. And many of the prescription drugs produce so-called side effects that are really magnesium deficiency problems. Exacerbated by the effects of the drugs, including death. Death is usually the last side effect.
Side effect I don't want to experience.
And that would make sense, knowing the work of Dr. Mildred Seelig, a brilliant MD who in the 70s and 80s was studying the relationship between stress, magnesium deficiency, and heart attacks. And my friend and colleague, who got my first hair analysis in 1980, already knew the research of Dr. Seelig. That's why he put his thumb and forefinger that close together to warn me of my risk for a heart attack with such an acute magnesium deficiency. So my thanks to Dr. Seelig for contributing to saving it and extending my life, and leading me on a path into HTMA in general, and eventually becoming magnesium man. Because over the years since then, I've been constantly talking about the importance of magnesium. And in some of our networking groups around where we live in Arizona now, near the Sedona area, I would constantly be talking about the importance of magnesium. So one time at a luncheon meeting, I get up to speak, and one of the ladies says, "Oh, you're this magnesium man." So when she said that, it resonated with me. So I went across town after the meeting to a t-shirt shop and ordered a Magnesium Man t-shirt, which they designed. With a great big shield against the blue background of the shirt. And instead of a big S in the middle of the shield, they put in a big MG. And
that's fantastic. When my wife's grandfather, he's 90. Actually, he's turning 100 this year. He's turning, I think, in a few months. And he says when he was a kid and his mother had a lot of health issues, and he said that she went and talked to a German physician, and he said she had arthritis, and he said to take Epsom salt. So put Epsom salt in a glass of water, put some lemon juice in it, and drink that every day. And he said, so he's done that his whole life. he's turning 100, right? And he's, to this day, if I want to go visit him, he's like, having his Epsom salt, and he goes, it keeps my bowels moving. And, he's like, and I don't have arthritis. So he's like, I'm 100 years old, and I don't have the problems that these guys have in my,
Well, I just turned 85.
Mm-hmm.
And there's no way I could have made it during these 42 years without that first hair analysis detecting such an acute magnesium deficiency and leading me to appreciate supplementation, and eventually leading me to start to attend the seminars that Dr. Eck and Dr were giving in the early to mid 80s until they split up in 1984.
Do you want to talk about that a little bit, about how they had a conflict at Analytical Research Labs? And do you want to talk about what happened there?
My understanding is Dr. Eck had a background in health sciences. He read voraciously in the health and nutrition and scientific literature, and he became a vitamin and mineral salesman. And he'd call on different practitioners, mostly chiropractors. And Dr. Watts was a young chiropractor starting out his practice in Phoenix. And so they got to know each other, and they got curious about this newfangled test called hair analysis. So they began getting hair analysis data on Dr. Watts' patients. And of course, he had other data from other lab tests that they could correlate along with the physical exam that he did on his patients, and knowing what their various conditions were. And they both knew a lot about the research of Dr. Schroeder, Dr. Seelig, Dr. Pfeiffer, copper toxicity, and a good deal of research relating to the importance of minerals. And so they began to see certain clear-cut patterns of the slow oxidizer in comparison with the fast oxidizer. And they saw the patterns were exactly the opposite.
Right. So that would have been the classic oxidation rate based off of the calcium to potassium ratio and the sodium to magnesium one, right? Like the...
Yeah, historically, we need to keep in mind, this was between 1975 and 1980 when they did the basic research. And they established the foundation for this nutrition and mineral breakthrough using hair analysis data.
The new nutrition, I think that it was called.
Nutrition.
Yeah.
And so they began to give seminars. And the first time I heard them was in 1982 in the spring, when they came up from Phoenix to Chicago to give a seminar on hair analysis at DePaul University in downtown Chicago. And even though I was still recovering from my magnesium deficiency depletion, I had enough energy by 1982 to drive down from my suburban home to attend this weekend seminar. And I was just amazed at what they presented. But my initial impression was, this is wonderful. This is going to be the simple panacea. Because the way they presented the basic fat or slow metabolic type that I have summarized in my book, The Strands of Health, the slow metabolic type was exactly the opposite mineral pattern of the fast. So it seemed quite simple and clear. All you got to do is rebalance the minerals and restore a person's health. And then subsequently, because I was put on their mailing list, I started getting mailings from the analytic research lab that Eck had founded in Phoenix. So then I began to fly down from Chicago to Phoenix to attend these weekend seminars. And they would draw at least 100 to 200 people per weekend attending their seminars. they were really getting a lot of attention for their research and nutrition breakthroughs with hair analysis. And so I would attend seminars 2 or 3 times a year.
Okay, cool. And only one of those was recorded, as far as you know?
I don't know how they did the recordings, but they put the recordings together at analytic research labs in this set of CD recordings, which with technological developments, these are obsolete unless you still have a CD player around.
That's right.
But the essence of those early seminars is recorded on these.
Yeah.
And by that time, Dr. Eck recognized me and knew that I was a psychologist incorporating hair analysis into my psychological practice. And so after Eck and Watts split up in 1984, and Dr. Eck invited Dr. Larry Wilson to fill in the spot that Dr. Watts did. So at one of those seminars, I'm sitting in the audience, and Dr. Eck gives the introduction on Saturday morning, and after he talks for an hour, hour and a half, he could have talked for the whole morning. Once he would get started, he would go on and on. So when he's ready to take a break and have Dr. Wilson come up, he notices I'm in the audience. And he says, Dr. Malter, would you come up and say a few words about how you incorporate hair analysis into your psychological work, which I did. And Dr. Wilson is sitting on the edge of his chair, anticipating getting up and speaking, and here Dr. Eck inserts me, and so maybe that's why he's not a big fan of Dr. Wilson. So anyway, I'm recorded on one of these CDs.
Yeah, I've listened to you've talked about clinical experience and stuff. It's that whole CD is a historical document, and I don't think it's for sale anymore, unfortunately. The last I spoke with ARL. But, so just let's back up a minute. So when Dr. X and Dr. Watts broke up, you said about 1984 is when that seminar was recorded. So Wilson was there at that time. So
yeah, that must be right after Eck and Watts split up. And what Watts was noticing is that whenever they would have a client, usually a woman, go through a copper dump after being on a supplement protocol, what would happen with the retest, the copper would go up and she's releasing and dumping excess copper from cells and tissues, and it's being excreted through the bowel, the urine, and also being excreted through the hair with that elevation of the excreted mineral. But the same thing was happening with potassium. As copper went up, very often potassium would elevate. And in being elevated, it would lower the sodium-potassium ratio into what Dr. Eck described as a sodium-potassium inversion. And he related that to the life and death ratio. Because as a patient is dying and they go into kidney failure, the sodium-potassium inversion occurs in a dying patient. Yeah. So he was always obsessed about the sodium-potassium ratio. So he would see that copper dumping pattern, but with the sodium-potassium ratio and elevated potassium. And so he would try everything possible to lower that high potassium and restore a better balance of sodium and potassium, which made sense. Except that Dr. Watts was noticing when he would put these individuals on potassium-lowering supplements, usually calcium and vitamin D, that they would get worse.
Mm-hmm.
They would see this over and over again. And then it dawned on him what was happening with the elevation of copper being detoxed and dumped and eliminated from the body. That also was triggering a loss of potassium from inside the cells, creating a temporary elevation of potassium. And of course, lowering the Na to K ratio into a severe sodium potassium inversion. And Dr. Watts realized, hey, this is a potassium loss. And if you keep lowering potassium even more, you make the individual worse.
So that's during, you just be clear for everyone that's listening, you're talking about when someone is dumping copper and then the copper jumps up high to do, and then the potassium follows it. You're talking about that creating a pseudo inversion. Okay.
Yeah, but that then means that there's a loss of potassium, which is what Dr. Watts figured out. And copper toxicity and copper dumping associated with a sodium potassium inversion was Dr. X baby, so to speak. That was his specialty.
Yeah.
He could not tolerate a challenge to his thoughts about the need to lower that potassium that is elevated temporarily with the copper dumping. And that was a super fast oxidation with typically very low calcium and magnesium and very high sodium and potassium. And that meant that he was a very fast oxidation, an extreme type A personality.
Volatile, hey.
Psychologically having a short fuse, very low frustration tolerance. And it didn't take much to trigger him, and he could just blow up. In fact, I had heard some of the girls who worked in the ARL office say when he was around the office, it was like walking on eggshells. Because as brilliant as he was, with that fast oxidizer profile and short fuse, he could blow up in an instant. And that's what happened one day when Watts again challenged him about what he was doing with sodium potassium inversions in individuals' copper dumping. And so in a fit of rage, he just told Dr. Watts, get out of here, you're through.
Do you think that's what led to the birth of that product ZMC? Because I know Dr. Eck created limcumin, and he loved using limcumin, which is copper.
Limcumin, but he also created what he called MollyQ.
Yeah.
OLY was for molybdenum, and CU was, of course, copper. And molybdenum is known to be an antagonist to copper. So that was another favorite of his. Limcumin for sodium potassium inversions. MollyQ for copper toxicity.
Yeah. So, and MollyQ, just for the listeners, is that's a molybdenum black radish product that is no longer available either because
that is no longer available. Since he passed away about 25 years ago, his kids didn't know how to support and promote that. Also, another favorite of Dr. X was a product called Spartan MK. M for magnesium, K for potassium. That was a favorite of Dr. X because magnesium and potassium are so vital for intracellular function, including magnesium combining with ATP for energy. And they also discontinued that because after Eck died, I was one of the very, very few practitioners using Spartan MK with my clients.
That one you can't buy that product Spartan MK, but you can get, like potassium magnesium aspartate. That's still available from different companies.
It's basically the same product, but it's the same principle of providing that extra intracellular infusion of magnesium and potassium, which are so commonly deficient and have such a devastating impact on people's energy.
Would you think that using those aspartate forms of potassium magnesium would be helpful for that copper dump that leads to a potassium loss? Because potassium aspartate is really good at raising intracellular potassium. Do you think it would kind of plug the leak, or do you use it in that way? Or?
That's why Dr. Eck really especially like that kind of a product.
But for a pseudo NAK, like what Watts identified, do you think it would still be appropriate to use?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay.
And it would begin to give some hope to a severely copper toxic adrenal burnout person with a very slow thyroid and highly diminished energy. That would begin to give a quick energy boost, but without throwing them into a more severe copper dump.
Yeah, I can. If you have too much of that product, which I have at one point, it can cause some anxiety because it's really stimulating. And usually those slow thyroid people don't, just because you give them energy doesn't mean they know what to do with it, because they live their life in a depressed, energetic state. So I know firsthand it can cause a racing heart, and you feel like your mind's going a mile a minute, and it can even feel like copper dumping. And I'm sure it can even stimulate it by increasing metabolic functions.
Right. And so over the years, we've learned to be much more cautious, because we've learned that as vital as the mineral system is, as reflected in HTMA data, it's a very delicate system. And some people they're much more reactive to any change in that system than many other people. And so we have to recognize that and start people more slowly, see how they initially respond, and indicate to them that when they're using HTMA data and going on HTMA protocols, they need to really have a heightened awareness of their own responses, and they need to be flexible. And I remind people, the HTMA data were not handed down on Mount Sinai with the 10 Commandments in stone. It was not handed down in stone. And the dynamic nature of the mineral system means that people need help in understanding changes can occur very quickly when they're given the right supplements, guided by their own HTMA data. And to be flexible, on some days they may need more of a particular supplement protocol. On other days, they may need to cut back, and that's fine. That's going to work best.
That's great you pointed that out, because I think people overlook the fact that in HTMA, if it's a 3-month picture or 4-month, depending how long the sample was, that it's an average of that time period. So you can have, you might in the bigger picture have a low NAK ratio, but that doesn't mean every day you have a low NAK ratio. That just means on average over that you have that ratio, right? And so sometimes you might tolerate a product and the next day you might not in the same way, but that doesn't mean that next week you will, you'll have that same response. And I know that people are quick to say, oh, I can't take this product, or I'm intolerant to this. And it's like, once you start shifting things, you might be able to, you need to be open to change, and then be aware that your body can change as well. And that means how you respond to things can change. So just because someone says, oh, vitamin C helped me when I was younger with this problem, whatever it is, it doesn't mean when they get that problem 20 years down the road that it's still going to help them.
Right. Well, so, if I can give an example from my own experience, I'm a fast oxidizer. And fast oxidizers will tend to have very low coppers and be prone to copper deficiency, what Dr. Watts calls an absolute deficiency of copper. And so I would start taking a copper supplement. And sometimes even a 2 milligram copper supplement at some point in time could trigger a severe nauseous reaction almost instantaneously. Mm-hmm. Because it would drive my potassium down. I always tended to run a high sodium potassium. And a high sodium potassium, besides being an index of stress, also is related to nausea. So as soon as I would get that copper-triggered nauseous reaction, right away I would grab a zinc, swallow a zinc with water, and bingo, the nausea would evaporate almost instantaneously.
Yeah. It's amazing how quickly you can undo something like that. Because I've shared in the past about me taking 35 milligrams of copper, which I know people poo-poo on. And I know your wife also had a comment at me about it before. But, I'm open to playing. I'm open to trying new things. And, for me, when I took 6 milligrams and I took it 6 times a day, as 36 milligrams or something. And when I did that, I definitely got nausea. And it was the exact same thing that I did. I was like, well, if I took this much, I took 2 zincs and it went away. And then I was like, okay, well, I'll just take more copper. And because there's a perspective Dr. Eck used to say is that if you're a fast oxidizer, you're deficient in copper, but you have an increased requirement for zinc as well. And that he would say that it does the opposite effect like it does in a slow oxidizer. He would say if you take zinc, it actually raises calcium, right? And that might be why he was trying to use with that pseudo NAK. He probably kept using more zinc as well, which probably furthered the copper dump and then furthered the loss of potassium. But I don't know what his perspective was, but that zinc copper blends as well can be really helpful. And I would use that as an antidote as well. Or even if I was already taking a lot of zinc, I might look at taking manganese or something, or more vitamin B6 or something to counteract it as well. Mm-hmm. So do you think that ZMC from Trace Elements is kind of like a good alternative to Limcomin for the copper toxic individual? Do you think that's why it was made? It's zinc, manganese, vitamin C?
Dr. Watts knew that zinc, manganese, and vitamin C would help move more copper with fewer copper dumping symptoms and to support the copper dumping.
So do you think that would be a good product to use for that pseudo NAK during that copper dump?
I use a lot of it because, there's so many of these copper toxic individuals out there.
Yeah, but that's why I'm asking.
But we don't use it when there's the latent hidden copper toxicity. We wait until we see the elevated copper showing either in the initial test or on a retest before we introduce the ZMC.
Okay.
So we don't want to trigger a copper dump when there's a hidden copper or latent copper until we build up the elimination pathways. Okay. Liver detox is absolutely essential for copper toxic people because of the copper overload in their liver.
Do you have any favorites for that?
Oh, my wife has been a Shackley distributor of their supplement products.
Which company is that?
Shackley, which is an American company started by Dr. Shackley. This goes back to probably 60 or 70 years, right after World War II. He was a chiropractor, and he developed his own supplement product line and developed a whole supplement business and organization with multi-level marketing. And so a lot of people became distributors. And my wife has been a distributor. So we use some of their products.
Okay.
And the liver detox has primarily milk thistle and other plants and herbs in there. And it's a good quality liver detox. But there's plenty of other liver detoxes.
Okay. Yeah, just curious what you use, because we all have our favorites, and even though there's other products, right?
So when I work with people, if they have other choices to help detox the liver, that's fine.
Okay. What are your thoughts on when you have someone with a very low copper, like 0.5 or something? And what are your thoughts? Like, are you thinking hidden copper or latent copper? Are you thinking copper deficiency?
If they're a slow oxidizer, and especially if they have a very high calcium potassium ratio, that probably means that they're in an adrenal burnout. They can't even mobilize a little bit of copper to show higher in the hair analysis. So they're in serious trouble.
What about
and one of the illustrations I give when we talk about copper toxicity, and a lot of people have trouble grasping this concept. How can a copper toxic person be copper deficient in terms of copper metabolism? Well, I describe it as being in the middle of the ocean with a vast amount of salty seawater around. You have all of this water, but you can't safely drink it. So the copper toxicity would be like being on a copper sea, but the copper is not in a form that's healthy.
Yeah. If I use the example often of being at like a farmer's market, and, you know, like they usually take cash, you know, and it doesn't matter how much money you have in your bank account, you don't have available funds to buy whatever you want. So you could have a whole bunch of it, but also not have enough of it at the same time. So it's similar concept that I try and use. Sorry?
Can I add that to my repertoire?
Of course. You know, I learned that one only because that happened to me at the market. And I was like, this is a lot like Copper X. So what about your other thought on, like, you talked about like that low thyroid function with the low copper. What about a high NAK ratio, like really high, would say like 20 or something, or even higher? Copper typically, at least my learning is, copper can raise sodium. So usually you don't want to use it for an elevated sodium potassium ratio. And if they had low calcium magnesium, at least at ARL, we'd call them mixed oxidizers. So what would, because they have a high sodium potassium and a very low copper, and they would be mixed, fast mixed in that perspective, would you still use copper? To me, it's a conundrum for me. So I'm just seeing what you think.
If they have a very high Na to K ratio with a very low potassium in the ratio, knowing that copper will lower potassium and elevate that ratio. And already, if they have a high Na to K stress ratio, we know that stress triggers a loss of magnesium from inside the cells. So if you give copper and drop potassium, increasing the Na to K stress ratio, intensifying the person's stress response, look out for magnesium loss.
Yeah. I just thought I'd ask you because I thought about it. I'm like, a that low of a copper means they're deficient. And I'm like, usually their zinc's going to be high, which means they have a high zinc to copper ratio. So they have a relative deficiency. They have a low level, which could be perceived as an absolute deficiency, but then the HTMA pattern doesn't fit it. So I just thought I would ask you, what your thoughts are.
About an extremely low copper. Back in the 1980s at their seminars, Eck and would note that once the copper drops below 1,
Mhm.
in the HTMA, the person's risk for developing a malignancy goes up.
Mhm.
And so they knew there was a connection between a critically low copper, and this could be even a biounavailable copper.
Mhm.
The risk for malignancies would go up. And Dr. Watts told me that sometimes he'd see that chronically low, extremely low copper level. And sure enough, in 6 months or a year, the person was experiencing a malignancy.
Mhm.
But since cancer is such a super sensitive health issue, after a while they seem to become more cautious about talking about that cancer indicator in HTMAs. And interestingly, back in the mid-1980s, even after Eck and Watts split up in 1984, there was still a great deal of interest in the seminars. And then lo and behold, in August of 1985, the Journal of the American Medical Association ran an article on HTMAs in August 1985. And it was written by Dr. Stephen Barrett, who has set himself up as the quackbuster in chief. And that article almost put the hair analysis labs out of business, because it was published in JAMA, and it was accompanied by a massive press release and media campaign. One of my clients called me after reading an article about it in our local newspaper and asked me if I had seen it and what I thought of it. So I went over to our local hospital medical library and read the article. And the title of the article referred to HTMA as a scam. And then as I read the article, it was based on shoulder-length hair samples from two 17-year-old girls. Someone told me one of the girls was Barrett's daughter, and I guess the other was a girlfriend. So I guess he offered to give them a haircut, cutting samples down to the shoulder, so he could chop those long strands into 1 inch samples, mix them all together, and assume they were identical.
There's a lot wrong with that, though, before, because hair changes as it grows. It's not uniform.
No. I understand that he washed all the samples with tap water from his kitchen sink. And who knows what was in the tap water. So he sends them off to 13 different labs. They come back with different readings. But when you look at the data in that article, lo and behold, calcium is high in both girls. Sodium is either low or at the average level, and potassium tended to be low.
So they're slow oxidizers, basically.
Yeah, and what do you think the copper level was?
To be honest, Rick, but I haven't seen the actual data because I don't have access to the paper, but I imagine he didn't even let it run 30 seconds to get the copper out of the pipe. So he probably was contaminated sample. So it's probably high.
It was both girls had slow oxidizer patterns with high coppers, which is not unexpected with two 17-year-old girls who may have already become estrogen dominant and obviously copper toxic.
Yeah,
I would love to see a follow-up and see how those girls are doing 35 years later as women.
Yeah, that article is still being published.
Of course,
and reference to this day about accuracy.
They're not going to retract it.
No, but I mean, even the people like in current new research that comes out published with hair testing, they still cite it, but they've never actually read the paper, and they don't know, if they know anything.
They don't know anything about hair analysis.
Yeah.
They couldn't read that article critically anyway. But it was published in JAMA. It makes for an impressive citation. And then they did a similar kind of attack on HTMA in January of 2001. There were 4 people from the California State Public Health Department. And one of the authors of that 2001 study, I guess, volunteered her hair. So she provided the hair. They said they were replicating Barrett's study, coming to the same conclusion that hair analysis is not accurate. And they also put out press releases and a big media campaign, gaslighting hair analysis. And that almost put the nail in the coffin of hair analysis.
But there was a good thing out of that study, wasn't there? There was a good information if you understood the data in that study. It was that there was 2 labs that had very good accuracy. One of them was a licensed laboratory. I don't even know why it counted. And the other one was off because they washed the sample. So,
well, I had access to the article, and I was able to figure out which labs were probably TEI and ARL. And so I wrote a rebuttal article that Dr. Abram Hoffer published in the Journal of Orthomolecular Medicine. And I showed a comparison of the data from the 2 labs, and the data are virtually identical. Now, what they did in that study, instead of sticking to the raw data and making comparisons of the actual numbers, like I did in my article, what they did is they looked at the lab reports, interpreting the numbers as being either above or below average or average. Well, as soon as you get into talking about lab numbers as above, below, or average, you're already into interpreting the data and not reporting raw data.
Yeah, because different reference ranges, right?
If you run a correlation between the 2 sets of data from TEI and ARL, the correlation is well above 0.9 in terms of a reliability correlation. That means that the data are virtually identical.
Very close, yeah.
Which is what you want, is to have a very, very highly accurate report. Now, what they did, for example, in that lady's data, and it was based on one 40-year-old woman, her phosphorus level was 12. And one of the labs considered a 12 phosphorus as being within the average range. The other lab described the phosphorus of 12 as below the ideal phosphorus of 16. So what they did is they tabulated the data, comparing a phosphorus in the average range and a phosphorus below, even though the numbers were identical.
It's ridiculous.
And they published that kind of junk science.
Yeah. And that's the stuff that gets published, and that's the stuff that medical doctors read and think is accurate because they believe the conclusions and stuff, and they don't have a critical mind. You know?
And so fortunately, Dr. Hoffer was willing to publish my rebuttal article.
Yeah, no, that's unfortunate for hair testing, but really, you know, it is very accurate, and it's still used to this day for toxic metals. I know.
Accurate.
Yeah. To the sample, though, not to averages across different labs, because that's the same problem in blood tests. Is one lab will say the average thiamine level is something between something. Another one will say, oh, no, that it needs to be smaller or bigger than that. And then it's not exclusive to HTMA, that kind of.
And with HTMA data, you have to have extremely narrow ranges for interpreting the test results. If you try to expand and use wide ranges, plus or minus 2 standard deviations in statistical terminology, then you have idiotic conclusions that extremely low levels of the mineral or extremely high levels are falling in the average range. You lose all sense of the value of an HTMA when you do that.
Do you think ARLs are still reasonable, how tight they are?
Because they were established in a time where it was easier to get truly healthy individuals.
Mm-hmm.
And given the devastating effects of the female contraceptives, starting around 1960.
Yeah.
And as they marketed the female contraceptives, the birth control pill, and then the copper IUDs, the estrogen raised copper levels. And we know as copper goes up, potassium goes down, the Na to K ratio goes up, magnesium goes down, and calcium goes up. And so it started a cascade of changes in the underlying mineral dynamics of millions of teenage girls and young women. And then when they got pregnant, after they became so copper toxic, their excess copper and or mercury and other toxic metals gets transferred into the fetus. And in each new generation, more and more babies are born with excess copper.
You know, personally, I don't know if you agree, Rick, but I think that there's a blessing within the curse of a baby born with high copper, or even someone with high copper. And to me, that blessing is that if you compare the toxicity of mercury and copper is a lot more tolerable.
Oh, absolutely.
Right? So, and copper can block mercury's metabolism in the body. So I think even nature's designed to protect the fetus from a toxic metal like mercury and increasing copper,
Right.
Knowing that copper is it's not easy to get out, but it's less severe as far as symptomatology, especially in a younger individual with higher adrenal gland activity, typically. So they're more likely to be able to metabolize that copper, being fast oxidizers. And then nature's plan works. So I think it's a blessing and a curse with that whole thing. So I don't always just say, oh, everyone's copper toxic when they're born, because if it's a healthy baby and they are developed, nourished, adequately, I don't see it as a problem. But to the child that ends up on, maybe bottled milk or they don't eat properly, and then I think it can get very severe quickly, and that might be why you have young children with a lot of issues these days.
Yeah, and we have to come back to biochemical individuality. We can talk about copper toxicity as a general concept category, but with tremendous variation in terms of the amount of copper that is built up in different individuals, where that copper is deposited, whether it's deposited primarily in the liver or in the brain or other organs and tissues. And so even though we can talk in general terms about copper toxicity, we have to recognize there's tremendous variability in regard to the nature of the copper toxicity buildup in different individuals and the impact on health.
And that's just one nutrient, right? Copper. You got to consider that you having I might have higher B1 requirements than you, not because I'm deficient, but just because my body uses it a lot more differently or needs more to get the same job done, whether genetically, environmentally. My mental processes are different than yours. So all of that can influence the amount of nutrients you require. And that's like Dr. Derek Lonsdale, who's known for his research in thiamine, used to say, like, you can have people that need up to like 1,800 milligrams of thiamine, vitamin B1, and you can have people that improve drastically on 200, 300, but that variation is very severe on how much you actually need. And I know Hoffer as well used to talk about that with niacin, and he would say some people can get by with a couple hundred milligrams, other people need 3,000, 6,000, 9,000 to keep their psychiatric symptoms at bay. And that's just that individual approach.
Yeah, and we have to understand and appreciate the value of biochemical individuality.
I think that is the future of medicine, and I think it's the future of natural medicine as well. I don't think genetics is the right way to go about it personally, but I think nutrition is.
I think genetics has been a rabbit hole that's become a huge distraction.
Yeah. It has some good things, like Wilson's disease. We learned a lot about copper metabolism. Yeah. But genetics itself hasn't solved one disease. And really, modern medicine hasn't really corrected one disease since like World War II or World War I, I'm pretty sure. I think the antibiotic was the only thing that they ever actually have something that's cured something. Other than that, they're very unsuccessful. To be honest,
John D. Rockefeller recognized at the beginning of the last century that he could expand his petroleum product market by having medical labs create drugs and pharmaceutical companies create drugs from these petroleum.
So, there was a whole attack on natural medicine since, it's been going on for a long time.
Yeah.
And it's no different these days, if not, I think sometimes now they let some of us speak on certain topics because they see it as it's so out there that you think they might think others are wacko just for talking about it, right? Like nutrient therapy correcting issues or stuff. They allow that, but I think it's also because a lot of drug companies own nutrient companies. So I think they don't care if we all make the switch to nutrition, as long as they're the one that's getting their products funded. But where do you see hair testing going in the future, Rick? Like we know the past we've been attacked, and we know that right now there's not so much collaboration going on and stuff. So where do you see it going, and where would you like to see it go?
Well, we have to recognize that operating a hair analysis lab involves tremendous investments in terms of the equipment needed, hiring the expert personnel to run the equipment.
Mm-hmm.
And even though as practitioners, we're dealing with a lot of people interested in hair analysis, but the healthcare marketplace for hair analysis is very, very tiny. And so the labs seem to be more concerned about keeping or expanding their share of this very limited hair analysis marketplace.
Mm.
And they have not seemed to be willing to sponsor professional conferences, to share research, and to support research and look at clinical cases on a large scale.
Mm.
So that's one of the factors. And the fact that hair analysis has been maliciously attacked over the past 35 years by JAMA, and obviously the AMA and Big Pharma and the media. I would not count on eventually getting hair analysis recognized by the media.
Okay.
Or by medical schools. I think I would like to see hair analysis information made more broadly available to large numbers of the members of the public.
Mm-hmm.
To educate, and we have the tools to help support that kind of mineral and health aid education.
Yeah, that's one of our goals with this podcast, is bringing forth the mineral-minded practitioners, the mineral-minded people. They don't have to be practitioners, the researchers, the whatever, where we can talk about that and bring up the conversation of it, and then get other people's opinions. So that's one thing we're trying to do with this podcast, at least.
Yeah, and that was evident with the podcast with Dr. Selig and with Rick Fisher.
Mm-hmm.
They presented some very, very valuable information, and your discussions with them were outstanding. And those are a part of mineral analysis education. And hopefully with the internet and internet searches, more and more young people will become curious about health in general, nutrition, and minerals, and hair analysis.
Yeah.
And you don't have to go to medical school or nursing school or a dietitian program to learn the basics of the concepts and principles, which are based on solid scientific research and clinical practice to learn and appreciate hair analysis. In fact, that's one of the paradoxes.
It's so simple, but it's so intricate and difficult. Is that the paradox?
You summed it up perfectly. Simple, but intricate and complex.
Mm-hmm.
But that's the nature of the mind-body system and the mineral dynamics.
Right.
Basically, stress and cellular energy production.
Absolutely. So you think that there's still a chance for hair testing, at least as far as naturopaths, natural medicine, chiropractors, that kind of field? Or you think that it should be more set up for like mineral balancing as being its own individual modality? And
I am not very encouraged by the response that I've had from naturopaths and even some chiropractors. For some reason, they just don't see the unique value of looking at the mineral system as a whole, understanding its dynamics, and studying it in an in-depth manner to really learn the basics and see how it applies.
I think it's sometimes the more you know, the more easy it is to ignore other things that don't fit your belief system. So I think it's something like that. So you think that there's a chance of mineral balancing becoming its own natural medicine modality at some point?
Well, what I think is going to happen is that big pharma and organized medicine are going to keep lobbying state legislatures and Congress in the U.S. To further attack and limit HTMA.
Okay.
We already have seen that New York makes it virtually impossible to legally even cut a hair sample, let alone cut it and send it into a lab. And California just recently passed a law that only a medically trained practitioner can order a hair analysis. Even though virtually all MDs know very little, if anything, about hair analysis.
haven't been trained in it. So if anything, it's irresponsible. It's like saying, only farmers can do taxes or something. It's like, they don't know it. They might have a little bit of but like probably not.
These are the kind of political and legal attempts to attack and to limit hair analysis.
Yeah.
And that's why I think it's got to go through the grassroots.
Yeah, it's got to be grassroots, and I think it needs to be backed with the science as well. And as science grows, and I read research papers, but I'm not like a scientist. And like a proper scientist using the scientific method, I think is important. But science-ism as a religion and saying, oh, if it's not published in the paper, then it's not true or something. Like, I don't believe in that.
What people don't realize is how much science has become politicized.
Yeah. And religious. It's become a religion too.
No. And academia is highly political.
Mm.
And this has been known for generations.
Yeah. All right. Well, it was nice having you on, Rick. It's a real pleasure to have someone with so much experience in the field, 42 years. Holy moly. I hope I have that much experience one day.
You have a great foundation. You've built up a lot of excellent experience. And it's just a matter of keeping our thinking caps on. My third grade teacher in elementary school talked about have your thinking cap on when you're learning. Mm-hmm. And as long as we have our thinking caps on and we're thinking and analyzing and applying what we know, fine-tuning it, we'll advance our own expertise and be able to share that with others.
And that's true development as well, really. Like when you are growing as a human and growing and maybe learning new things or coming at it in different ways. I had one of these, I was gardening and I was thinking about growing up in a time when people say, the good old days. And they're like, the good old days when I was young was like the smell of cigarettes, it's like in the restaurant, everywhere, everyone smoked. So it was like the good old days. But then I thought back and I'm like, one of the things I learned, and it seems simple, but it's look both ways before you cross the street. Right. Mm-hmm. So it's kind of like before you make like a definitive stance, look at both sides of the picture. Right. To see what's going on. But I was like, look both ways before you cross the street. It's just one of those simple things, like put your thinking cap on. It's like, well, and I think huge implications if you think about it outside of its context normally, Yeah,
and I think with HTMA science and principles and concepts can hold their own against any other healthcare approach.
I really think that's true too.
But there's no interest in making comparisons between what happens with people doing HTMA and following HTMA protocols versus other nutritional approaches, and certainly against allopathic drugs and medications. There's no interest in that. No. That would be true science. But the healthcare marketplace is such a lucrative marketplace. There isn't a strong incentive to maximize health science and understanding and advancement.
I believe if we can truly nourish people, when we can truly incorporate hair testing and mineral balancing science, then we can reach a new normal as far as like human health. I think, like kids growing up these days, I think it's normal to have brain fog all the time and that they can't concentrate and all that. And that's normal, right? And it's normalized by society. But I'll tell you, as soon as I started nourishing my body and getting some of these metals out, balancing my hair test, my intelligence went right up. I found so much easier to retain information, to learn new things, think outside of the box. And, like it was just like a light bulb turned on, it reminds me of one of these. I was worked with this, more of this simpleton kind of guy who's like lived out in the bush, and we were working on his electrolytes. And he goes, ever since I got my electric lights on, he's like, I'm so much brighter, And I sometimes I make the mistake when I say electrolytes now, because I always think back to him. It's like, now I got my electric lights, I'm bright.
One other aspect about hair analysis. I don't know if you had Target stores in Canada, or you have those in Australia.
We got them in Australia, definitely.
Okay. So the Target emblem is a bullseye with a bullseye in the middle. So one time when I was driving up to a Target store, I'm looking at their logo with the Target. And it dawned on me, when it comes to nutrition and health, HTMA hits the bullseye of the target. Whereas most of the other approaches, if they hit the target, they hit the outer rings of the target, which means that they often go round and round in circles before getting to the underlying essence.
Exactly. It's like we talk about shotgun supplementing, where you just kind of take everything, whatever's on sale, supplement roulette, spin the wheel and see what we land on. What's on sale this week? Oh, vitamin D. I guess I'm taking that. That's what a lot of people do.
No.
Hair testing is just like, no, what do we need? What should we focus on?
No.
And that's really what it hits the target. Like you're saying, it just hits the bullseye. It's precision versus more the merrier. And I often use the example of your body is intelligent. It's brilliant. It's a wonderful phenomenon. The phenomena of man is, amazing, but throwing everything at it isn't better, because it's the equivalent of everyone on your street calling 911 at the same time and saying, we have a fire, right?
No.
There's not enough resources from the local emergency thing to go to everyone's house at the same time. So you need to focus on what's priority. And even though you might know of other things that are issues, it might not necessarily be the thing to do right away. And then we always got to work with that life force of the body, where regardless of what we think is the best thing to do, like as a practitioner, as a client, or, a person that's trying to heal, we might have our opinion what the best thing to do is, but then our life force might just say, yeah, I know you're worried about your eyesight, but your heart function is very important, and that's our priority, So, and people might go, oh, I can't improve my eyesight or something, but they don't realize how intelligent the body is. And maybe it's a good thing it's not focusing on your eyes or whatever, for example, right?
Yeah, and the wisdom of the body, to give another example, if a person is becoming critically deficient in magnesium, most of the time, the person will experience muscle cramping, say in their calf muscles or other somatic muscles, giving an early warning, hey, you're becoming magnesium deficient.
Yeah.
Rather than having that first sign being a cramping of the aorta and the heart muscle.
It's a good thing.
By the time that happens, most people are done.
Right. And that's just the body's wisdom as well, redirecting it to a less severe thing. That's a fantastic example. One last thing, just before we go, Rick, I'm just curious, because you talk a lot about magnesium, the magnesium man. So there's a lot of talk about boron and its use of holding magnesium in the cell. Do you use boron in your practice? Do you use borax or a supplement, or you don't use it? Okay.
No, we use mainly magnesium products, mainly magnesium malate with B6.
Okay. Just thought I'd ask, because I've been coming across lately using like, it's a product available only in Australia. I think it's called Magoro or something like that. And it's basically magnesium orotate. And I use it as another way of increasing magnesium, intracellular magnesium. And then there's other products that come out. I think there's one by Designs for Health, and it's like Tri-Mag Supreme or something. And obviously I'm not paid by these companies to mention them. These are things I use. And Tri-Mag Supreme is like 3 different types of magnesium. So to mix up the forms, I think can be helpful as well. Those are things I do.
Getting magnesium in besides our diet sources and magnesium supplements would be magnesium lotions on the skin, and magnesium baths and soaks. But if a person has long hair and they're doing a magnesium bath, either Epsom salts or magnesium chloride, if they're doing those soaks regularly and getting the magnesium water on their hair, that might contaminate the hair sample on a retest. So,
I have found that to be true, honestly. They sit back and, they bring in the tub and they get it in. And then a lot of people do use the neck hair right there for the hair sample. Little different if you go above the ear, but some people still get it wet or they dunk their head, and, it is a contaminant as well.
Yeah, so it's just another complexity that we need to be aware of. Right. Now, in regards to the Cal-Mag ratio, one more thing about that, especially when there's a high NA to K stress ratio, and they have a low ratio of calcium to magnesium. That's reflecting a magnesium loss under stress. And quite often, that ratio may be associated with a history of abuse, where the trauma of abuse got so imprinted into their mind-body neuroendocrine system that they are super reactive to stress and a loss of magnesium.
That pattern, I learned it as a hill pattern. It looks like a shape of a hill on an aerial chart. Every time I see that, I think of you. Oh. I just, cause you're always talking magnesium loss, the high NAK ratio for an acute stressor. And I'm like, that's the pattern. Every time I hear Rick talk about magnesium and, and that potassium and all that, I'm like, that's the pattern that I think fits your whole, what you talk about with magnesium and all that perfectly.
Now, do you have my graphic that I made up showing magnesium and potassium as being the primary intracellular minerals, but easily losing those into the blood, out the kidneys and urine for excretion, but the hair follicle picks them up?
I've seen your little drawing. I don't have it on like a document or anything, but if you after this call, if you want to send me stuff, and I'll put it in the notes of the show, and then I'll also, put your copper toxicity link and then your link to your book and stuff. Do you have a Zoom call coming up? Is that right? Or am I mixing something up?
Yeah, we're going to do another one on stress.
Okay.
Since millions of people have been subjected to an incredible amount of stress with this whole COVID narrative.
Of course.
And so using HTMA concepts, you can bet more people became magnesium deficient, losing magnesium, but also losing zinc.
Absolutely.
Potassium.
Absolutely. And we use zinc to retain potassium on the hair test to raise potassium. And it's one of the big uses for it. It's that iodine and vitamin A, if you're into that, are like the stars. So, so if you want to share that information as well, you can send it to me.
I'll send you out the symptom checklist and also that graphic.
All right. You're a superstar, Rick. Really appreciate your work. I consider you one of the pioneers along with Eck and Watts. So keep doing what you do.
I'm glad to be able to give back over these past 40 odd years.
Fantastic. Well, hopefully we can have you on again. Maybe we'll talk about some new topics. And thanks for joining us in the Mineral Minded podcast.
Okay. It's been a pleasure.